Hello, I'm Stephanie Eckel. Welcome to Dear Daughters of God, where we explore that sacred thread between generations. In this episode, we're going to open up an old classic. Many of you are familiar with this book, but it's actually not the story in the classic book that we're going to explore, but the story behind the old classic. Yes, it was Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls. To remind you about one of the highlights of this book was in the early part of the book where Wilson Rawls describes puppy love. And he says it's not the same puppy love when you have a crush on the girl down the road, but the kind with 4 feet, a wagging tail, and sharp teeth that nibble your fingers, a love that gets all tangled up in your dreams. Billy, the young boy in The Red Fern Groves, the main character, he desperately wanted a coonhound dog, 2 of them. And he prayed for this, and it didn't happen. And he was so disappointed that he didn't get these coonhound dogs because he felt like just desperately what he needed. Well, he had his conversation with his grandpa about it, and his grandpa said, "You don't just get it by praying, you need to make an effort, patience. Otherwise, everyone would just be sitting around making wish lists, and that's not how the Lord wants us to be. He wants us to be hardworking." Billy decided, well, I'm just going to put an effort into it. And he started selling bait to fishermen and doing every odd job that he could find. And for 2 years, he saved his money in the hopes that he could buy 2 coonhound dogs. Finally, after 2 years, he has $50. And he goes to his grandpa's store, which is the general store, and he wants to put in an order for 2 coonhound dogs. And his grandfather says, "Boy, Billy, that's a lot of money. I mean, family could really use a new milking cow. I can think of several other things your family needs." And Billy said, "Well, this is my money. I've been saving it." And he was insistent, and he said, "No, I want to order these 2 dogs." So he put in the order, and good news is the price for the 2 coonhound dogs had come down about $10. It was now $40. And so he decided, well, with that extra money, he bought his dad some overalls and his mom some material and his sister some candy. And then he was ready to go off to retrieve these coonhound dogs. They weren't coming to him. He had to walk 30 miles, and he did, in bare feet, with a gunny sack to carry those coonhound dogs. And when he got there, he cut a hole in the gunny sack for the heads of the coonhound dogs and walked 30 miles back. He stayed in a cougar's cave to make sure they were safe. And this was the beginning of Billy experiencing true puppy love. Now we have a glimpse into the heart of Wilson Rawls, the author of the classic book, Where the Red Fern Grows. Now let's look at the story behind the classic book, the story of Wilson Rawls himself. Wilson grew up on a poor dirt farm in Oklahoma in the 1920s. There was no electricity, no plumbing. His best friend was his coonhound named Rowdy. His mother loved books, and she was their teacher because the school was too far away to attend for Wilson and his sisters. So his mother did her best to educate them. She taught them how to write their names and some basic mathematics, and she read to them books. Their grandparents owned the general store, and she would order books from the general store and read these to her children. But Wilson, he didn't like books because they were all about fairy tales. And he thought, that's a girl's world. And my sisters, they live in a girl's world, but me, I'm a boy. I live in a boy's world. So he was not interested in these books. But one day his mother said, "Wilson, I've got a new book and you're going to like it." He said, "No, I'm not, Mom. No, I'm not going to like it. I don't like books." She said, "Well, let's just give this one a try." And she began to read the book, Call of the Wild by Jack London. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. And something ignited in Wilson. All of a sudden, there was a story that he could relate to that was a little bit like his life. A dog that understood hardship? That would be like Wilson's dog, named Rowdy. And he couldn't wait for his mother to read again. And she kept reading and reading, and when she finished reading, she just gave the book to him, and he carried it all around with him as he read it. And as he told these stories about Call of the Wild to his own coonhound, he began to dream of himself as an author. It was something he really wanted to do. But he didn't have any paper. He got some of his grandparents' brown grocery bags, and he wrote on the scraps of them. He would write stories of his own, and he would write about characters, and then he would read these portions of his stories to his dog, Rowdy. Rowdy was expected to sit up tall and listen. And after he read them, and he felt like he'd done all he could with that story, he'd wrap them up in twine, and he would hide these stories away in his father's steel trunk. And the reason he hid them away is because he was embarrassed. He didn't want anyone to see them, because he didn't know how to spell. And he didn't know how to use punctuation, and that would be terribly embarrassing if someone saw it. So this is where he stored these stories, on the brown paper sack in his dad's steel trunk. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. When the Great Depression hit, Wilson was a teenager. He thought his parents had too many kids to feed, so he left. He went off on his own to get work. And he would pick up odd jobs. Sometimes he'd ride freight trains, and became a carpenter. And he worked and slept in work camps. And eventually there was a Texan that hired him as a craftsman, and he would travel with a group of craftsmen. They even worked in Mexico. And at night, these craftsmen would go out on the town. They'd meet women, they'd tell jokes, they'd laugh and sing. And they noticed that Wilson never left the room. He'd never go out on the town. And they'd say to Wilson, "What are you doing? Writing letters here all the time? Maybe no one's writing you letters. You have no one to write letters to. What are you doing here?" And he would say, "Oh, it's none of your concern. I'm just comfortable here." And he'd be writing stories at night. He'd be writing stories. And he'd never let anyone see these stories because he didn't know how to spell. He didn't know how to use punctuation. So they were just for himself. But he did dream of being an author. He figured, I'm not the type to marry because I'm a loner. And what woman would want to marry me? I'm dreaming to be an author and I can't even spell a word. Yeah, I'm not going to marry. But the Lord often places people in our lives that fill the places where we feel small. And this is what happened to Wilson Rawls. On Wilson's next adventure, which was in Idaho, he met an accomplished woman named Sophie Ann Styzinski. Sophie Ann was a university-trained mathematician, and she worked as a budget analyst for the Atomic Energy Commission in the 1950s, which was a rare position for a woman to hold in the 1950s. It was a well-respected position. And they fell in love. Wilson and Sophie married in 1958. Shortly after Wilson and Sophie were married, they traveled to Arizona because Wilson's parents had moved there, clear from Oklahoma, across the country to Arizona. And one day in this visit, Wilson happened upon his father's steel trunk. And he couldn't believe that inside were the brown paperback scraps wrapped with twine. And it just made him blush at the idea that Sophie might see these handwritten, poorly spelled stories. He couldn't imagine it. He didn't want her to know it. So he burned them. He burned the original manuscripts. But although he burned those original manuscripts, the story of the boy with his 2 coonhound dogs just burned in his heart. And one day he just told Sophie. He told her the whole thing. He said, "When I was a kid, I didn't like books. And then my mom read to me Call of the Wild, and it just ignited a love of books. And it brought to my mind my own story about a boy and his 2 coonhound dogs. And I wrote that story with misspelled words all over the place on brown paper sacks, scraps from my grandparents' store. They owned the general store. And then I wrapped them. I put them in my dad's steel trunk. I couldn't believe it, but they were there. When we went to Arizona, I burned them. And Sophie said, "What? You want to be an author? That's amazing. You have a story within you? You've got to bring it out again." And he said, "Oh, I can't even spell a word right. I can't be an author." But she encouraged him. She said, "No, no, you've got a story within you. You can do this." And she let him borrow her courage. And with that courage, he began to write. He began to write the story from his childhood about this boy, Billy, and his two coonhound dogs. After he finished, just like Sophie had promised, she corrected the spelling of all of his words, which was most of them. And she had a punctuation at the end. And then the book was published, and eventually it became very popular in elementary schools and middle schools. And it was Wilson and Sophie that traveled across the country to 2,000 schools, visiting the students and sharing the stories of Wilson Rawls and how he became an author. Wilson was known to stay at book signings until very late, sometimes midnight, because he couldn't imagine leaving one person without a personally signed book. And Sophie was always right there with him, steady and strong. There wasn't pride in her help, only love and service. Elder Garrett W. Gong recently said, quote, "When we reach out in love, God magnifies our small and simple acts, and the blessings ripple farther than we can see," unquote. That's what Sophie did. Her confidence helped launch a book that has blessed generations. Moroni teaches, quote, "Charity seeketh not her own," unquote. Sophie lived this principle daily. She didn't make it about herself. She simply lifted the person she loved. As I think about this story, I wonder what the world would look like if all of us tried to be the Sophie for someone in our life. Being the Sophie does not mean having a governmental job or a degree in economics. Rather, it means you choose generosity over pride. It means you see potential where someone else sees weakness. It means you share your courage when another person's courage runs slim. Being the Sophie is choosing to love in a way that something I can work on. I invite us all to carry Sophie's example in our hearts. Be the Sophie. Lift, serve, reach out, encourage, and watch how your simple acts ripple outward in ways you may never fully see. Would you like to preserve that sacred story that you want remembered? You can do it right here on Dear Daughters of God. Leave me a comment and we'll start to work together to get your story preserved right here on Dear Daughters of God. For now, I'll say farewell until we meet again.